Hello, I am Lisa Carrico, Director of Family and Veteran Programs for the Missouri Humanities. We are a member-supported organization, and our mission is to connect Missourians to the people, places, and ideas that shape society. Thank you for joining Chapter 4 of this 10-part virtual storytelling journey that brings the book Growing Up with the River, 9 Generations on the Missouri to life. Growing Up with the River by Dan and Connie Burkhart explores our state's rich cultural heritage through the eyes of 9 generations of children growing up in river towns along the Missouri River. Each of the 10 chapters will be presented by a professional storyteller and special guests. The series will run every Wednesday at 4 p.m. on Facebook Live, ending on September 30th. Today we'll explore New Haven. The year is 1883. New Haven is buzzing with activities. 4 trains a day pass through, bringing passengers and freight, taking flower and fruit trees to market in other towns. Steamboats and ferries stopped with passengers from St. Louis, as well as from southern Warren County. The boatyards built bigger and bigger to compete with the railroad. And today we'll explore one such steamboat with an unfavorable fate. Today's chapter will be presented by Brian Fox Ellis, an internationally acclaimed author, storyteller, historian, and naturalist. For 25 years, he's been a Riverlorian for the Spirit of Peoria Riverboat, and he's also performed on the Delta Queen and American Queen. After Brian's reading, we'll introduce our special guest for this chapter. Special thanks to the Burkharts for writing such an enchanting book and for entrusting us to share the stories within. And to artist Brian Haynes for allowing us to share his beautiful book images with everyone today. Please let us know you're watching by asking questions and leaving comments. In partnership with the higher education channel HEC TV, St. Louis Storytelling Festival, Missouri History Museum, and Magnificent Missouri, we present to you Growing Up with the River.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. I had the great honor of meeting the Burkharts and then was challenged to learn a chapter 4, which is next week, actually chapter 5, and the Burkharts are going to read it. So I'm really looking forward to hearing them next week. So Riverlorian is one word you mentioned and asked that I define. I am in charge of the lore of the river. I've been working on paddle wheel boats for more than 25 years. And one of my goals is every year to look at a different layer of the river history. The river is a time machine, and I'll talk more about that later. Let's delve into 1883 in New Haven, Missouri, on the shore of the Missouri River. Steamboat coming, steamboat coming, steamboat coming, black smoke fills the sky. Looking up into the cottonwood branches, listening to the flies buzz and the hot, damp air hanging over the river, it was hard to imagine that in a few months she would be standing on a frozen river. At this moment, the river was calm and welcoming, doing its part in the baptism of new believers from the Second Christian Church, where many of the Black families in New Haven attended. Watching from a respectful distance, the girl saw the faithful wading in, being dipped in the water, and then joining others on the bank. The song and prayer were gentle and even more muted by the lapping of the warm water on the bank. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, now wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. The Civil War had been over since 1865, long before she was born. But her parents had told her stories about the soldiers who fought to free the slaves. As she watched the congregation, she wondered whether some of them had been enslaved. Today, they were freed men working on the steamboats, working on the railroads and in the mills. She was relieved that the war was over and that they were all free. Now she just wished that they all went to church together. In a couple of months, though, this same stretch of river would not be a good place for baptisms. The river would be frozen, as solid as a stone. And the cold wind would be there, blowing snow across the surface. For her brother, winter on the Missouri was the most exciting time of year, better even than his birthday. He counted the days until it was time to harvest ice. He loved the noise and danger as the men cut, sawed, and chiseled ice into blocks that were pulled by teams of horses to the river's edge. He studied every man's role in the process and proved how strong he was as he gathered stray chunks. He knew that cutting ice was something he would want to do when he grew up. After the harvest, the men drove the horses to the empty ice house to unload and stack the ice. On a bed of sawdust, they laid out a layer of ice, then another thick layer of sawdust to keep it frozen solid, then another layer of ice, more sawdust, and so on. The work exhausted the men and the horses, but everyone in town needed the ice. They appreciated living on a river for making it possible. When you were a baby, our food would spoil in the summer. Now you can have ice-cold glass of milk with your pie in June. Who can believe it? Mama asked as she slid a slice of peach pie towards the girl. Her brother acted like he did a lot of the work, so she teased him by giving most of the credit to Barney. Barney was the horse who pulled the ice wagon through New Haven, bringing small blocks of ice to keep the ice boxes at home nice and cold, and their food fresh. Anyone who needed ice put the "Ice Today" sign in front of their window. Look, Barney can read. He's stopping at our house. Actually, Barney stopped in front of every house, whether they had a sign or not, but she would never admit that to her brother. Their cousin, who lived on a farm across the river from New Haven, came to visit frequently, and she was amazed by their ice box. Most of the farm families had spring houses to keep their food from spoiling. A spring house was a tiny building that let cool water from an underground spring flow around the eggs, cream, and milk. Cousin thought that having an icebox inside your house and an iceman delivering a piece of ice that had been cut from the river just months ago was incredible. Ice in July seemed like magic. By the end of summer, though, the town's ice house would be empty, and the next harvest was still months away. In the fall, when everyone missed the ice, her brother was even more sure he wanted to grow up to be an iceman. The girl could see why her brother would like to cut and deliver ice, but in her view, nothing was better than going to school. Even though their town was small, it had 2 schools. The children from the river baptism, they went to one school, and she attended the other. Her school building was brand new, and nothing smelled better than the rows of new benches, the new lumber and varnish and paint and slates. All smelled heavenly. And she told her brother so. Ew, I can't concentrate because it all stinks like a new school. Makes my nose itch, he said. He demonstrated by trying to rub his nose off his face. Fact was, her brother didn't like to sit in school all day. He wanted to be down by the river, but it seemed like everyone always had other plans for him. One of her favorite classes was geography, so she could see where her family came from, Prussia. Her teacher said, put your left pointer finger on the Missouri River and your right pointer finger on the Rhine. Let's imagine how very, very hard it was to get from there to here. She knew that her grandparents had been extremely brave. Her parents ran a bakery, and they lived above the store, so the entire family worked there. Before they left for school, the children swept the floor and the porch and wiped off all the counters. Their teacher sent grade cards home to the parents to grade the children on their farm and home chores and on their manners, so they tried hard to get good grades from their folks too. But the boy, he just wanted to be on the riverfront. Their town was so busy, it seemed like everyone wanted to come to New Haven. Steamboats stopped at the riverfront with passengers coming and going all day long. Some stayed at the Central Hotel on Maupin Avenue. The steamboat New Haven traveled to places upriver and down, almost 60 whole miles, to Black Walnut in the east and Chamois to the west. Some of these boats traveled all the way up the Missouri as far as the Dakotas and Montana. Their teacher told them that when their town first started, it had a different name, Miller's Landing. Up and down the river, Miller's Landing was known for its woodyard. The unlimited number of trees growing along the river was what steamboats needed most: firewood to power their engines. The children loved the smoke and noise of the big steamboats. They and all their friends knew the names of the boats, the routes, the fares, and timetables, and how many people they could carry. The riverfront seemed busy, but their parents and others said that every year there were fewer and fewer steamboats, and that the trains were becoming more popular. The whole town looked forward to the steamboat that was the biggest of them all, the Montana. Everyone said that if any boat could beat the railroads, it was this one. The Montana was more than 250 feet long and seemed to fill up the river when it passed by. The train and steamboat schedules mattered a lot to her parents. The bakery needed the business that the Pacific Railroad and the steamboat New Haven brought to town. Smaller boats, called ferries, brought people from the north bank of the river, from the towns of Treelor, Holstein, and Pinckney, several times a day. Passengers who didn't even realize they were hungry would follow the smells to the bakery and buy some special treats to take back home across the river. The girl asked her father why he decided to open a bakery. And he said, "Well, because you can't catch or shoot pies." "What, father?" He said anyone could go to the river's edge and throw in a line and catch a big catfish, woohoo, perch, bass, or even a sturgeon. A hunter could walk to the edge of town and he could shoot a turkey or a deer. In the old days, there were even elk and bear, but now they are gone. Father said that by working hard, he could make something people couldn't shoot or catch, and that made a bakery a good business. Of all the boats on the river, one was the clear favorite of the girl and her brother. It was the only riverboat that didn't need any firewood. When their cousin came to visit, she often came on the Tilda Clara. Like the other boats on the river, it had a paddle wheel, but it was different from the other boats because it didn't use firewood to make steam to turn the wheel. It had horses on board. The horses were harnessed, and they walked on a treadmill to power the paddle wheel. The Tilda Clara only went short distances back and forth across the river to ferry people from one side to the other. Their family had taken a trip on it, and this was the one thing where the children agreed. Even though steamboats were bigger, this was the best river trip ever. The steamboat brought goods to town, but they mostly brought people. The trains brought all manner of goods from far away and carried things as well as people. Fruit trees from the nursery and flour sacks from the mill filled up car after car after car, shipped from New Haven to who knew where. Somewhere there must be planting a lot of trees and baking a lot of biscuits. Her father told her that there were as many bakeries like theirs, and every single one needed flour. But not every town had a flour mill like New Haven's. One evening after the store closed, as they made their way upstairs, their parents told them that someday there might be a way to deliver ice with a wagon that ran on steam power, like the steamboats. Barney would be out of a job, but at least they knew people would always need ice from the river for their ice boxes. I love the way that this book takes us back in time. And having worked on river boats, and actually, now I think about it, I tell stories on trains now and then as well, at the Train Museum in Monticello, Illinois, if you haven't been. The river itself is a time machine. And if you're on a steamboat heading down the river, you are traveling back and forth through time, especially on the Missouri River. You can see the bluffs along the shore that are layers of geological time. If you could travel through time, you would travel back to the Mississippian era when much of this area was a shallow sea. And if you look in the white gravel, you might find little seashells. The American Indians paddled canoes on this river. That's my boat, the Spirit of Peoria. And we cruise up and down the Illinois and the Mississippi. We usually come to St. Louis a couple times a summer, obviously not this summer, but it's a beautiful boat. And from the deck, you can see all those layers of history. From the American Indians who once walked along this shore and paddled their dugout canoes, to the French explorers who brought birch bark canoes from the far north, to the pioneers who traveled on flatboats and keelboats. Why, even Abraham Lincoln traveled down the Mississippi on a flatboat, and Mike Fink, the most famous keelboat man. And then, of course, steamboats dominated the river for many years. The steamboat itself was the king or queen of the inland waterway. But yes, they were replaced by trains. But notice a lot of the train tracks follow the river valleys because they're relatively level. And by building trains along the river, they hope to put the steamboats out of business, and they nearly did. We've been traveling this river for many years. One of my favorite characters to portray is Henry Detweiler. And Henry Detweiler actually piloted a steamboat for many years. And Henry Detweiler was good friends with Abraham Lincoln. He delivered troops and supplies throughout the Civil War. And then after the war, he got into the ice business. And ice from the Missouri River, I'm surprised because it's a very muddy river, but I'm sure a lot of the mud settled out in the winter when the river slowed down. But Henry Detweiler cut ice from the Illinois River, which was much cleaner than the Mississippi. And so Anheuser-Busch bought ice from Henry Detweiler on the Illinois River, and they often used barges to take it south. He had a big ice house along the shore, which today is a marina. So the public still has access to Henry Detweiler's river. Well, I wish I had more time. I do have just about 30 seconds left. If there's a question or two, I'd be happy to answer. Any questions about the chapter, about steamboats, about hauling ice on the river? Could you imagine taking that big saw out there and sawing through those layers, cutting those big blocks? And the most amazing thing is they'd store it in layers in sawdust, and it would not melt. All summer long, through the heat of July and August, that ice would still be there until they finally ran out. And if they timed it right and sold their customers, they would still have a little ice left when it started to cool off in the fall before it froze and they could cut more. Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the next presentations, and maybe we'll see some of you next week when you get to visit Tree Lore Store.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that lively narrative.
And one last thing, a lot of my riverboat stories are in my new book, brand new book, A River of Stories, which you can find on Amazon. And they also are on my podcast, Foxtails International, if you want to check that out. Foxtails International on YouTube or wherever you get that. How long to cut those ice blocks? Great question, Rachel. They actually had huge saws, like the kind that you cut down trees. And so these saws, the screen's not wide enough, you know? These saws would be 10 feet long, literally. And they would cut the blocks in huge squares. So it'd be as much as a ton of ice. And I would guess it would take, half hour to an hour to cut each block, and then load it into the wagon and take it to the river shore. And the ice houses were always right next to the river, so they didn't have to transport very long. And they had sleds, and it would slide easily across the ice once they got it out of the river.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that lively narration and for sharing your stories and knowledge. And great question, Rachel. I was wondering the same thing. So that helps me. I also love the idea of a boat moving along the river as a time machine. So thank you for sharing that. And we will put a link up for you for people to easily find your podcast on YouTube. So thank you. Today we have two special guests. We have Jeannie Damschroeder, and she will discuss the history, renovation, and her experience as the innkeeper at the Central Hotel. And Annalise Corbin, archaeologist and also CEO and founder of the Past Foundation, and she will discuss her research and excavation of the Steamboat Montana. So if you have any questions during their presentations that you would like asked, make sure to put those in the comments, but I will turn this over to Jeannie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm at the Central Hotel here in New Haven, and this has been a hotel since 1879. And it stayed a hotel until 1937, and then it changed. But in our lobby, we have a picture of a gentleman by the name of John Coulter, and he was with the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he was a scout. So he went out and scouted the routes for the expedition to travel, the safest way from all the Indians, who was friendly, who was not. The Blackfeet were the unfriendliest, so he would always avoid them. And he was the first known white man to scout the Yellowstone National Park area. And so he was the only man that was allowed to lead the expedition, and all the other men on the expedition had to sign contracts that they would not. So when he left the expedition, he settled near New Haven called Beth Creek, which is about 5 miles out of New Haven, maybe not even that far. And he made a little settlement and met his wife, and they had children, and they have found a gravesite of the grandson of John Colter on one of the bluffs. So that is why we think he's buried here. And we have a John Colter Museum in our downtown area. So back to the hotel. We again, it was built back in 1879. My Minnie and her husband Henry Tigler, I'm sorry. In 1879, when they came from St. Louis, they saw a need for it, and so many of the railroad workers and the steamboat workers would come up and stay, and passengers would stay at the hotel. And so then in 1910, 1919, I'm sorry, he sold it to Ben Zeixman, and they ran it to 1930, 1930, 1929, and that's when he sold it to the McDonald's. Now, we don't have that warranty deed, but those are the two original owners of the hotel. But the McDonald's, because it was during the Great Depression, they started a restaurant on Thursday nights. They would slaughter 35 chickens and fry it up and sell it to, again, the passengers off the train, their guests, any of the townspeople that had any money that they could afford to go out to eat. And that's how they kept their business going. And then in 1937, they sold it and to a couple, and they converted the hotel into individual apartments. And they had 3 apartments. And then during the 40s and 50s, many young New Haven couples just started their families here. And I have had many people in the New Haven area tell me that this is where was their first apartment when they got married, or this is where their first child was born when they got married. And a lot of them say they haven't been in the Central Hotel since they lived here, and they'd like to see it. So I always tell anybody, if you see a red car parked out front, I'm here. I would more than like to give you a tour of the hotel to see what it looks like now, because it is a great place. Then when the Zobers bought it in 2006, it was ready to be torn down. I mean, it was in shambles. And as you can see there, it is just in horrible, horrible, horrible conditions. But as they were taking off the layers of siding, the Central Hotel name was revealed. And so that's why they kept the name of the Central Hotel. All the windows are the same, in the same place as they were back then, and had the same shape. Even the little half moon at the top is still there. So it still had, and this is the gentleman that did the majority of the work. His name is Melvin Starkey. He knows where every single electrical wire, every water pipe is in the hotel, and he still works for the Zobers. And he'll be 82 years this December. But he is just a gem. He is a craftsman. He built those staircases there by hand that you see, and he just a lot of different little details around the hotel. So, I mean, that's what it looks like today, and it's kept up very nicely. And again, the Zobers are the ones that own it now. Mark and Ellen. Ellen was born and raised here in New Haven, and her family has been here for many generations. And that's why she didn't want to see this building go, because she just felt that the neighborhood would go downhill if it was gone. So they bought it and turned it into a bed and breakfast. So I have guests from all over. I've had them as far away as China. I've had them from Paris, France, Canada. Just this past week, I had somebody here from Maryland. I had them from Nebraska and Ohio. So they come from all over. So it's just a really, but the biggest name that has ever stayed here is Pat Benatar. She was performing at the Washington Town and Country Fair, which is the next little town. It's not a little town. Next town east of us, and they have a big fair every year, and they have really good entertainers. So that Pat Benatar is the one that sang there, and one of her top songs is "Hit Me Like a." Oh, shoot, I can't think of it now. Anyway, she has won many awards. So it was. I wasn't here when she stayed here, but I've been here for 8 years. I'm in my 8th year being here, and I absolutely love it. So if you're ever out in the area and you'd like to see it or stay, and you see the red car parked out front, I'm more than happy to give you a tour. So thank you all very much. Does anybody have any questions? I can't hear you, Lisa.
Sorry about that. The only question that we've had is the hotel open for visitors? So you went ahead and answered that. If there's any other details you want to, where people can find you to stay a night?
I have a website, and it's called the Central Hotel NH for New Haven.com, and you can find the website, and that has the information, the phone numbers, and all that information on there. You can call me direct, So anyway, it's just a great place to stay.
Well, I know that Jeannie, I know that I want to get down there, and I'll make sure to look for the red car.
Okay, sounds great. Sounds great.
All right, we'll turn this over to our next guest, Annalise.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you today, to talk with you about one of the things that is my passion and love. I am an archaeologist, and specifically, I am an underwater archaeologist who studies shipwrecks, mostly on inland waterways, which you heard from our reader talking about. The river system, and so I like to study steamboats. And so how lucky for me that the steamboat in the story we were hearing today, the Montana, is one of the steamboats that I had the chance over the years to excavate. And so we're going to take a look together at 10 images that help us understand the story of the steamboat Montana and its role in the history of the Missouri River, and more specifically, how it relates to New Haven and St. Charles and St. Louis and all of that part of the world. So if we could take a look at the first image. So as you heard earlier, the railroad had come in along the Missouri River, and one of the end results of that is that the steamboats were not being as productive, if you will. The railroad was trying to take over all of the business and industry, and so some of the steamboat companies who had been around and operating on the Missouri and the Mississippi River for many, many years at that point were really looking to see if they could keep the steamboat industry alive. And so a man by the name of Sanford B. Colson, who is a longtime steamboat operator, and his partners decided to build 3 large steamboats. And they built the Dakota and the Wyoming and the Montana, which we'll look at in a second. And all 3 of these steamboats were some of the largest steamboats ever built to operate on the Missouri River, which is really quite remarkable. They are a good almost third bigger than most of the steamboats that operated on the Missouri River. And the goal of Sanford B. Colson and Company was that they wanted to have vessels that were large enough to basically out freight the railroad. So let's look at image number 2, which is the Montana, which is going to be part of our story today. And a couple of things that I want to really make note of, and we're going to look at some other images in a minute that will help us understand scope and scale and size. In 1879, again, the railroads were really pushing through the Missouri River region, taking over commerce and traffic, bringing supplies and people. And the steamboat companies were hoping that these three mega steamers could save the industry. And the Missouri River is not only a giant muddy river, as you heard, as it relates to all the sediment and the ice and so on, but it was also a turbulent river at many times, especially when the ice broke and the river opened up in the spring and well through the summer. It also got hot and dry, and the river could get really, really shallow. And so the Missouri River steamboats evolved over time to have a very particular design. They were very flat bottomed so that they could float in the shallow water. And this is a picture of the Montana at the height of its heyday. And you can see it's loaded with passengers, it's loaded with wood for the steam boilers, and it ready to roll. So if we take a look at the next image, this is actually an image from inside the main cabin of a vessel called the Ida Reese. And the reason I'm showing this image to you is because I want you to see how tightly packed everybody is sitting. You can see some tables and some gentlemen sitting around those tables, and there's not a lot of room between the tables and the walls, which is the entrance into the cabins. If we take a look at the next image, image number 4, this is the same interior salon, but of the Montana instead. And so things to note, tons of room. The tables are actually set on the diagonal because there's so much room. The Montana is 252 feet long, and she's 48 feet wide. So a big, big vessel. And she has a 6-foot hold, which she could fill with cargo. If we take a look at the next image, please. This is actually, and you're gonna have to squint, so I apologize, but it's a great image. The vessel with the great big tall stacks, that's the Montana. And if you look really, really closely, sitting in front of her in the foreground is another steamboat. And that particular steamboat was called the Penguin. She was a small steamer, but she was still very typical of the Missouri River. And so you can see how small the Penguin is compared to the Montana. It was going to take a vessel of the size of the Montana, making several trips a season all the way from, at minimum, St. Louis up the river to be successful and to be productive, to actually beat the railroad. But that was a pretty tough thing ultimately to do. If we can go to the next image, we'll see what ultimately happened to the steamboat Montana. In 1884, as the Montana was going up the Missouri River, right outside of St. Charles, ironically enough, the steamboat got crossways in the wind. One of the bad things about how big the Montana was is essentially if there was too much wind on the river, and there was often that on the river, that ultimately the vessel was so big it was kind of like a sail. And so even though she had big engines and a giant paddle wheel, it could still be really, really tough to maneuver, especially in the currents around the railroad bridges, keeping in mind that we now had all these railroads in and around the Missouri River. And the irony is that the steamboat Montana hit the railroad bridge, stove in her bow, or the front part of the vessel, took on water very quickly and started to sink. The captain was able to get the Montana up alongside the shore. No passengers were lost. Nobody lost their life in this particular shipwreck. But the vessel very quickly filled with water and with mud and was not able to be recovered, to be repaired, and to put back out into service on the river again. And so instead, what happened to the Montana is that as her hold filled with water and with mud rushing in from the Missouri River, she got really, really heavy and because she was so big, she was almost like 2 steamboats on the inside from a structural standpoint. And I'll show you an image of that in just a minute. And she literally unzipped. She broke in half down the middle. And so all they could do was salvage her. And so this image is one of the vessels that came alongside ultimately and salvaged the Montana. If we look at the next slide, please, number 7, again, you can see more of the vessel as they're salvaging her. She was so big that they were able to actually cut off the first 100 feet or so of her bow after they removed all of the machinery, all of the goods, and actually turned that into a barge, and were able to use that part of the hull and the vessel later. A lot of the upper works, so the pieces that you see in the imagery right now, as they salvaged the wood, they salvaged the glass, they salvaged the furniture. A lot of that stuff, the bell from the steamer, actually ended up in the local Missouri region. And there are homes, there's a church and some other places in and around New Haven and St. Charles and all of that area where pieces of the Montana actually remain today. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the Montana and the wreck site of the Montana actually still sits in the Missouri River today. What was left after they salvaged what they could, cut the first 100 feet off, took the engines and the boilers away. What's left is sitting alongside the river. You can see one of those other bridges in the background there. And in 2002 and 2003, I took a team of graduate students from East Carolina University, and we began excavations of the remains of the Steamboat Montana. All that's left is the stern portion of the vessel. Its paddle wheel is all still there, although it's fallen down into the river. And we had an awful lot of mud. One of the things that's happened over time is as the river freezes and thaws, it breaks the wreck up. Over the lifetime the wreck has been there, lots of people use the wreck for fishing. There's old historic photos of the wreck, being a popular place to have a picnic and all of that type of stuff. And so there's not really cargo left on the Montana, but there's an awful lot of structure. If we can take a look at the next slide. You can see we're actually excavating down inside of it, and it was filled with mud, really, really, really dense mud, which is the reason why it's still preserved today. It's actually in really, really good shape. And when the river is low enough there at St. Charles, Missouri, you can actually still today see the Montana as it sort of sticks up out of water. We learned an awful lot about the Montana because the fact that it was built so late in time, if you will, in the steamboat history. It actually has elements in its structure that are closer related to vessels that we see that were built, steel hulled vessels and less wood hull steamers. So we'll take a look at the last image because this image gives you a great opportunity to see what's left of the vessel. The shaded outline is how big it was originally, and you can see all the framing of what was left of the vessel when I went there with my students and we started to excavate. One of the things that I told you is that when the vessel hit the railroad bridge and stove in her bow, and the Missouri River started to rush in. Keep in mind, she was fully loaded with cargo, not just the passengers that were on board. So she was big and she was really, really heavy. And when that happened, she literally split open along the center line as she started to sink and settle along the shore, because the captain pulled her along shore to be sideways, parallel to the shore of the river, to try to get everybody off. And when the port side of the vessel sat along the river and got heavy and started to sink, and the river channel, because she's so big, her starboard side was out into the channel of the river. And as she got heavy, what happened is she split along her spine. And so the starboard side of the vessel is actually still down, portions of it still in the channel of the Missouri River today. And that's where the Steamboat Montana now resides. And you can go visit her. And so a pretty amazing story. If anybody have any questions, but I really love the chance to be able to share pieces of this with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Annalise. I need to get out there and see if I can spot this wreck. And I had no idea. I forgot that it was a railroad bridge that it hit. So poor Steamboat Montana.
Yeah, you know, irony is something else, right? Yeah, absolutely.
I want to thank everyone that tuned in for our fourth chapter of Growing Up with the River. Thank you, HEC TV, for helping us present this program. Special thanks to our storyteller, Brian Fox Ellis, and guest speaker, Jeannie, for sharing about the Central Hotel, and to Annalise for all that cool knowledge about the Steamboat Montana. And thanks to two of our board members, Suzanne Evan and Trish Earthfeld, for tuning in today. Thanks to everyone who has registered in advance for this series. With each chapter, we'll be hosting a little giveaway to folks who have registered. And today we're giving away Explore Missouri's German Heritage by W. Arthur Murhoff, collaboration between Missouri Humanities and the Missouri Life Publishing. This book is your personal tour guide into Missouri's rich German cultural heritage, which includes rare archival material and places you can visit today. To learn more about this book, starting in September, our Director of Heritage will be exploring each chapter virtually with the author. So to learn more about that, visit our website. And today we'll randomly choose a name from the registration list to receive the book in the mail. If you would like to receive series updates, including links to videos, fun book activities, raffle prizes, visit mohumanities.org. And for today's activity in this chapter, the little girl narrating the story describes harvesting ice from the river. So we will be posting in our Facebook link this activity where you make ice and then you can have fun painting on it. So see how many times you can paint on the ice before it melts. We hope to see you all back next week. Book authors Dan and Connie Burkhart will be reading chapter 5. Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Bye-bye.